Good morning. I'm Rob Fuquay, senior pastor here at St. Luke's. Glad you're here today. We're coming toward the close of a series that we started when I got back from sabbatical at the beginning of the month. And I want to begin the message today with the prayer that comes from the Iona community. That's the island in Scotland where Christianity came into that country 15 centuries ago. So this is a prayer from the Iona community. Let us pray. O Trinity of love, God in community, holy and one, look on us now as we look to you. And hear our prayer for our community. Where there is falseness, smother it by your truth. Where there is coldness, kindle it with your love. Where there is joy and hope, free us to share it together and make us one as you are one. Amen. Well, there's an old African proverb that says, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. Say that last part with me. If you want to go far, go together. You learn how true that is when you go trekking in the Himalayas. You don't get to a place like the base camp of Mount Everest and then boast, look, I did it. Not by yourself. It takes a lot of help to get there. For instance, it takes Sherpas, guides who lead you. This is a picture of our Sherpa guides who led us on our trek. And the path you follow, in places, it's like a mini road. It's heavily traveled. And you think, well, this is a no-brainer. I mean, all you got to do is walk this path. You can't get lost. You don't need a guide. And sometimes you don't realize when you're following your guide that you come to forks in the path. And it goes in different directions. But when you're following your guide, you don't pay attention to that. And there are not any signs. There's not a sign in English that says Everest Base Camp this way. You are just following somebody who knows this is where you turn. And then you have porters. These are young Nepali men who carry your luggage. You are limited on this kind of a trek to 33 pounds for all of your belongings. It is amazing how hard it is to get your stuff down to 33 pounds. But that's all you can take. You have to have a waterproof duffel bag. And then every morning when you go to breakfast, you are to put your duffel bag outside your door. And then people you've never met come and get your bag. They stuff it in a red canvas bag, and then they carry it on their backs, and they get to where you're staying before you do. So that when you get to your room at the end of that hike, guess what? Your bag is in the room. People you've never met have been carrying your stuff. If you want to go far, go together. You know, that's true of every one of us. You don't get far in this life alone. Think about that for a moment. When you go home today and you turn on a faucet in your house and water comes out, what do you know? Somebody you've never met has been at work. When it's garbage day and you take your bin to the street and then you leave for the day and you come home at the end of the day and it's empty and you roll it back to the house, what do you know? Somebody you've never met has come by and emptied your garbage. We all depend on people we've never met. Now, we might get a little proud and say, yeah, but I pay my bills. I pay my utilities. It takes care of that. But what if somebody didn't do their job? What if somebody went on strike? We would be in a fix, wouldn't we? You never know, but when you meet a stranger on the street, you have met somebody your life depends on. Maybe that's why the writer of Hebrews included a very curious phrase in the 13th chapter. Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers. Perhaps the writer is reminding us that we live in an interdependent web with each other. This morning, Kylie Larson is preaching this message at Midtown. And when we met not long ago to go over the sermon, we were talking about this idea. And she said, that reminds me of a podcast I heard not long ago. It was about a discovery biologists made among trees that they have a communication network. It's called the mycorrhizal network. It's based on a fungus that forms around the roots of trees and protects them from disease. But this fungus also provides a communication network between the trees. Under the ground, the roots lock up with each other. And when a tree is threatened by a disease, by drought, it's communicating that information to other trees so that they can respond and try to protect themselves. Scientists say you can call this the wood wide web. But isn't it an interesting thought that God has woven into the fabric of creation a network among living things that makes us dependent on each other in order to endure? If you want to go far, go together. That's a good point to let us know about a way we can get more interconnected as a congregation. I want you to mark out the dates of March the 7th through the 9th in 2025. This is going to be a church-wide retreat coming up, and it's part of this sabbatical that Susan and I took. We have been asked in the proposal we made to the Lilly Endowment to look for ways to engage the congregation. So one of the ways we talked about was to come back and offer a sabbatical-like retreat for everybody. So spiritual director Amy Oden is going to be with us that weekend. We're going to go to the Epworth Center in northern Indiana, which is one of our great United Methodist retreat centers in Indiana. It's also where the Bishop Mike and Marcia Coiner Discipleship Center is located. Marcia, of course, is an active part of our church. Now, you're going to hear in the weeks ahead how to register and plan to go, but for now, just mark the date so that you get it in your calendar. It's going to be a great church-wide retreat because we all need to get interconnected. Why? Because if you want to go far, go together. That is what the writer of Hebrews wanted people to understand. After spending 12 chapters in pretty dense theological debate, the writer of Hebrews closes the letter, starting at chapter 13, with these final admonitions to the people. And the first admonition begins this way: keep on loving one another as brothers and sisters. And this is another occasion in which the New Testament offers as a model for the church the idea of family. The New Testament never says the church is an organization. Thank goodness, because we're not too organized. It never says we're called to be an institution. It says we are a family. Now think about what that means. How many of you grew up with brothers or sisters? You had at least one sibling. Show of hands. That's most of the people in the room. Most of you grew up with brothers or sisters. Now, second question. If you had brothers or sisters, how many of you chose those people? Yeah, it's a silly question, isn't it? You don't choose your brothers or sisters. They're chosen for you. That's how families work. Your families are chosen for you. So last question, those of you with brothers or sisters, how many of you would say there were times in our life that I found it really hard to love my brother and sister? Actually, I didn't mean for you to put your hand up on that one. Sorry about that. Your brother or sister might be in the room. Now, if they raise their hand, fair game. You can raise yours too. Think about what the writer of Hebrews is saying for the church. We are to love people we did not choose. And we are to love them not just when it's easy to love them. We're to love them when it's hard to love them. When we are the least lovable, we are the most in need of love. And we all need that. We all need love because we find that when we're in, how many of you can remember a bad place in life when you were not at your best? You were at your worst, you were at your lowest, and the only thing that got you out of that place is you had somebody to love you through it. You had somebody there to keep on loving and not give up on you. We know how much we need people to love us. So the church is called to be a healing place, but churches are like families. They're not perfect. There's no such thing as a perfect family. There's no perfect church. There are dysfunctional families. There are dysfunctional church. And if you've ever been wounded in community, then guess what? You need community to heal. It is community that will help you get beyond the recordings of hurtful wounds. And just as we've been wounded, we are capable of wounding ourselves. We all need healing. Rick Warren says everybody's got hurts, habits, and hang-ups. Everybody. We're part of everybody. We're called to be a brother and sister to somebody. And we are called to see others as brothers and sisters. But this doesn't mean we treat people like victims. This doesn't mean that just because people need our love and our compassion, that we are to treat them as recipients of our charity. Because the moment we start treating people as needing a handout, then we're going to keep them dependent on holding their hands out. We will make people go through life saying the reason I've got to hang up and the reason I'm hurting is because of what somebody else did to me. And the way in which we need to love people is back into a place where they do believe they have something to give, that they have something to offer. So think about this next statement made by the writer of Hebrews. Right after saying, keep on loving one another as brothers and sisters, the writer goes on, do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for by doing that, some have entertained angels without knowing it. Now think about that. In the Bible, angels are messengers. But most of the time, angels bring a message of blessing. That's why they come. They come to impart God's blessing to creatures. What is the writer of Hebrews saying? When you entertain strangers with hospitality, sometimes you don't even realize that you are able to receive a blessing they have to give. They become an angel to you. That the stranger you do not even know can be somebody who has a blessing to offer you. That is a takeaway of mine from sabbatical. In my journaling and in my writing during sabbatical, when I would simply kind of capture experiences I had, I would often kind of see things jumping off the page. I came back from sabbatical with words I want to hold on to, words that I want to continue to kind of live with me, shape me. And one of my words is attentiveness. Attentiveness, particularly attentiveness to people. Because I had lots of different experiences where it would have been easy for me not to engage with somebody, but when I did, I found myself experiencing a blessing that I wouldn't have had otherwise. Let me give you a little example here. In the village of Namche Bazaar, at just over 11,000 feet, we stayed 3 nights to give our bodies a chance to acclimate. And each day we would do hikes in the morning and then have kind of the afternoon free. So one day it was cold, it was rainy, came back to our hotel. I went to the dining room because it was warm. There was a little heater there. There was nobody in the dining room. I had a book with me, the autobiography of Sir Edmund Hillary, one of my heroes, first person to summit Mount Everest with his Sherpa guide, Tenzing Norgay. So I'm in there, perfectly happy, cup of tea, by myself, and I'm reading. Well, this Nepali girl who works in the hotel was coming around wiping tables off. And so she gets over near my table, and she doesn't stop. She just keeps moving, and she says, hello. And I could have just looked up and said hi and put my head right back down on my book. And I would have sent every nonverbal that said, leave me alone. But I thought, no. So I closed my book, set it on the table. I looked up at her. She spoke English very well. I said, hello, how are you today? And that stopped her. She was just moving along. And then when I asked her a simple question, she stopped. And she said, I'm fine, thank you. And then she looked at my book. And she said, Edmund Hillary, his son's here right now. I said, oh, wait, what did you just say? Peter Hillary, Edmund Hillary's son. He's staying in the hotel right now. Maybe you'll get to meet him. What? That's crazy. The next morning, when he walked in the room where we were having breakfast, I recognized him right away. I think we got a picture. He was willing to let me interrupt him and take a picture. I went up to him and I said, excuse me, are you Peter Hillary? He said, yes. Are you Rob Fuquay? He didn't ask that. I introduced myself. I told him I was reading a book his dad had written, and he said, oh, which one? He looked at it. Yeah, that's my dad's life, and we got to talking about his dad. He was gracious. He signed his dad's book for me, and we had a great discussion about his father, about mountaineering, about Mount Everest. He gave me some advice. When he sat down to eat breakfast, Susan got this picture. We looked up, and he was sitting below the iconic picture of his father and Tenzing Norgay, a picture taken right after they summited Mount Everest in 1953. Here he is having breakfast with a picture of his dad above him. I was like, gosh, I'm so great. What a surprise. I'm grateful that the day that I was there, Edmund Hillary's son is there, and I get to have this little blessing that happened because what? I just lifted up my head and said, how are you today? If I wouldn't have done that, I would have missed out on this moment. I would have seen him. I wouldn't know who it was. I mean, that's a little example. It's a little example, but it is a good reminder that total strangers around us all the time harbor blessings that can make our days better, that can give us something to remember and to hold on to, that makes life richer, and they're all around us. What would change if we looked at everybody that way? If we looked at everybody as somebody who has a blessing to give us, the cashier at the service station, the clerk in the store, the person who comes by to service something at your home, if you saw the stranger on the street as somebody who has a blessing to give, don't neglect to show hospitality to strangers, people you've never met, because you might come to realize that person has something to give you. They've got something that can bless you. One last thought about this matter of being in community is the next sentence that the writer uses in this admonition. He goes on to say, remember those who are in prison as though you were in prison with them. Those who are being tortured as though you yourselves were being tortured. As though you were in prison, as though you were being tortured. This might be the hardest thing the writer says. That to really enter into the territory of blessing and relationship, we've got to get proximate to people's pain. We've got to get close enough to them to understand life in their experience, or at least try to, and to realize what that can do for us. One of the things I have found when I read sermons by John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, who was a priest in the Church of England in the 1700s, when you read some of his sermons, you go, how did the Methodist movement ever grow? When you think about some of the stuff he said, it was so sharp and critical. You think, how did anybody stick around? For instance, in one sermon he preached called on visiting the sick. Now, doesn't that sound harmless enough? What can be controversial about a sermon on visiting sick people? But second page of the sermon, listen to what he says. One great reason why the rich in general have so little sympathy for the poor is because they so seldom visit them. Hence it is that one part of the world does not know what the other suffers. Many of them do not know because they do not care to know. They keep out of the way of knowing it and then plead their voluntary ignorance as an excuse for their hardness of heart. Indeed, sir, said a person of large substance, I'm a very compassionate man. But to tell you the truth, I don't know anybody in the world that is in want. Wesley goes on, how did this come to pass? Why, he took good care to keep out of their way. And if he fell upon them unawares, he passed by on the other side. Why did anybody stick around after hearing that? Why would anybody tolerate that? And I bet there were lots of Methodists who got up and walked out of the sermon. But I believe a lot more stuck around because they heard it and they heard truth. And what they heard was, that's what our world needs. That's what we all need. We need a community willing to be challenged out of their comfort zones, to love other people. And understand, we're not just giving away. We're not just loving people who depend on our great charity. We're loving people because we believe they have something to give us, that we need them, that we're in relationships of mutuality, that's why Jesus formed the church. And what a powerful thing it is when we experience that. Sometimes we discover our mountains in life when we get close to the needs of other people. Sir Edmund Hillary, this is the book I was reading. There's the signature by his son. What was Peter Hillary doing in Namche Bazaar, Nepal, when we were there? Let me tell you a quick story. I knew something of the philanthropy of Edmund Hillary, but I didn't know the full story. After he climbed Mount Everest, he became, of course, a rock star, known around the world. He had great speaking engagements. He got to know dignitaries in most of the countries of the world. People said to him, oh, you're going to be so rich after all of this. Later in life, when he wrote his autobiography, he said, well, that didn't turn out to be the case. But he went back to Nepal on a number of occasions to participate in other climbing expeditions. He never climbed Everest again, but he climbed some of the other big peaks. And this was before you had all of the hotels and places to stay for hikers like they have today. So when he went back on expeditions, he stayed with his Sherpa friends he knew. So he was staying in their homes and in their villages. And he realized how tough life is. That they didn't have running water, they didn't have electricity, that they did not have hospitals or schools for their children. And he thought, I don't have much money, but I have influence. And so he started going around to his friends he established around the world. When he went to speaking engagements where they'd always want to hear the story about Everest, he would use it as a chance to say, but let me tell you about another mountain. And he would talk about the Sherpas and the villages and the communities. And he said, I'm starting a foundation. And if you would like to help change this, we would value your gifts. And people started giving. And they started allowing for schools to be built and hospitals to be built and for services like electricity and water to be brought to these communities. Here is a picture of the first hospital that was built in the Khumbu region. The Khumbu is the glacier that comes down from Mount Everest. And many, many more were built. When you're on the trek to base camp, village after village, you see signs that say Hillary Hospital, it points the way, Hillary School. Sir Edmund Hillary became known as the king of the Khumbu, and it had absolutely nothing to do with climbing Mount Everest. It had to do with what he did with his life after that. The reason his son Peter Hillary was there is because of what became of that foundation. It's known as the Himalayan Trust today. And every time they dedicate a new school, a new building, whatever they're doing, the family members come to represent that. That's why he's carrying on the tradition. So after the first school was dedicated, in his autobiography, he said, "When I left Kumjung on the 13th of June, I little realized I was leaving behind what was to become a new way of life for me." In other words, Sir Edmund Hillary discovered a new mountain. I believe he would even say it was a better mountain. You never know how, when you're willing to get close to other people's needs and lives and see them as people who have a blessing to give, you discover God's mountain for you. If you want to go far, go together. Go together. So